The Marquise de Cat is often considered the easiest faction to learn in the board game route, the one that you would get a new player to start with. Well, I respectfully disagree. You need a lot of nuance and some crafty strategy to win with this faction. In fact, to beat the hard AI consistently, I needed to grind much harder with the Marquise than with any other faction. So in today's strategy guide, I'm going to walk through initial placements, builds, positioning, the best cards to craft, and all kinds of other juicy strategies here on Legendary Tactics. So it's no accident that I did all the other strategy guides before tackling this one. On the surface, the Marquise de Cat seems very easy to play, but remember, you have the most starting units of any faction, which means you likely also have the most starting enemies. In the late game, your faction stalls out when the board is saturated with powerful opponents, and scoring those last few buildings can become very challenging if you can't get into place and get the buildings down. So there's lots of different options and different paths you can go down here. So let's start with initial placement. So my first suggestion, and this one, I've tried multiple different options. This one seems the best. Choose a corner that's adjacent to the double rabbit clearing. So you have a rabbit on each side. And this works on the winter and the fall map as well. Your sawmill should go with your keep. I almost never in the games I play have this attacked and no one ever even comes to visit it. So you've got a constant source of wood back there, and you won't lose it in a surprise attack. Throughout the game, you'll likely make use of the rabbit clearings quite heavily, and we'll get to that when we talk about the cards, but the cards pair up really nicely if you can get 2 workshops down in those rabbit clearings. So position yourself to take advantage of those. Recruiters are usually best placed adjacent to your keep so that they can establish a perimeter defense, and that leaves room for a workshop also in your keep if it's happens to be a double square. Sometimes it's not. Most times it's actually just one. So let's talk about your initial actions. So if you start with a blue card, then you should use that to overwork. That's a blue wild bird card. You can spend a card matching the clearing of a sawmill too, and you can place an extra wood token there. So that's really helpful, and I personally like this one the best. So I would build first, then I would overwork, then I would build. Usually it's going to be something like the recruiter and the workshop. The recruiter's great because the faster you can go down that track, the quicker you'll get to the higher card draw. The workshop is what's going to help you get those early advantages and start to get your crafting up and running. So getting this extra build out early while other players can't knock it down gives you a running start. And remember, you're going to use this sawmill or whatever it is you put up. The faster you can get it up, the faster you'll reap those rewards. One really important strategic suggestion I'll offer is to put your initial buildings in 3 different clearings. Now this seems counterintuitive, and when I first started playing this, I used to group them together because I thought, wouldn't you want to consolidate and protect your power? But what I found was happening in reality is that you're committing too heavily in one clearing. You're stating your intentions, you're tipping your hand to your opponents, and they can really focus their efforts on taking you out in one shot. So you're completely pot committed without knowing where anyone else is going to be going or emphasizing. So especially the Woodland Alliance, they can really harass you in the early game and just keep spamming sympathy down, and you can't get enough troops in there to use martial law to prevent them from getting in. So I would argue that you should spread across 3 different clearings, and it may feel a little bit vulnerable, but remember that also offers you the chance to then add extra buildings to those clearings to deepen your holdings there as you go, and you can do that according to where your enemies show up. So this allows you to pivot in the direction where more growth can happen. So if one side of the board begins to get plugged up with all of the factions going there, you want to let them fight, let them battle it out, and you can actually go the other direction, get more infrastructure up, build your armies, get more soldiers out. This is perfect for you. But if you're pot committed, you're going to really hesitate to give up on that clearing, and you're going to stall out. So a second option for the initial actions, some people use this, and it would be to build the sawmill first to get your production going, and then move. And the reason people would suggest you do this is that you want to retreat those farthest units away from your keep in order to protect them, and also to start building up your forces so that people won't attack you, and also to consolidate places where you can place your buildings if you own those clearings. So you give up the clearings you can't defend anyways, you strengthen your position on the map. Personally, I actually prefer doing this in the second turn once my infrastructure is already up, because by then, if you lose a unit or two, it's not a big deal. I mean, if you really want, you can spend a card card and bring them back into your hospital. But generally, I just let them die because a single unit here and there isn't a big deal for the Marquise because you've got so many. So don't panic too much about losing a couple of those. The opening you will use will depend heavily on who you're up against. If it's human players and the WA has a grudge against you, you may want to retreat and consolidate. Whereas if you find yourself up against a more defensive-minded player, then getting your infrastructure built early will be a better choice, and they're not going to threaten that position. So part of playing with humans, it will be to decide and figure out who is it you're actually up against. And that's the beauty of this game, is adapting to that. So let's talk about the early game now. We know that long-term you can't possibly defend warriors on the entire board. It's very appealing for your opponents to get easy wins against stragglers and isolated units and buildings. So early on, you need to consolidate your troops so that you make attacks on you more costly. You can also funnel troops into central clearings by creating blockades around the periphery, and this actually forces your opponents more together and it helps you control the flow of the game more. If you have more active units than anyone else on the board, which you always do at the beginning, use this to your advantage. They're either going to waste time going around your units or they'll fight in the heart of your power, and this really becomes a win-win. But remember, you start the game strong, so don't steamroll your opponents too quickly because you'll make too many enemies early on, especially with human players. They'll start to get really angry with you for always taking them out. So as the cat, sometimes it's better to work slowly and surely and to sneak around the periphery. Next up is positioning. Depending on the style of your play, you might enjoy using my slow and steady approach. I tend to build outwards from my home base, amassing troops, fortifying buildings, stretching, finding gaps wherever I can go, and really avoiding a lot of early conflict. I only expand when I know I can defend those buildings, but there comes a point where you need to shift in the game, and then you start to send your troops out. You leave your buildings more vulnerable. If they get destroyed, they get destroyed, but at least you can go and place that next building. But that's the stage of the game where you're not absolutely necessary. It's not necessary that you, say, have sawmill production in every single turn. It is great if you can get a building or two down in a turn, because that's where your points are really coming from here. But to build, you're going to need lots of well-defended wood, and that's going to be a consistent resource you'll need throughout the game. One counter to the Marquise is to take out sawmills and hamstring them, so don't let this happen. Tuck them in behind your line so it takes them a long time to get there. You'll see the attack coming and you can defend it if you need to. Expanding around the periphery of the board lets you get that infrastructure built. If you go right into the heart of the board, you'll probably find that you're continually attacked and embattled all game long. So rather than growing, you'll just be slaughtered and forced to rebuild each turn. Turning to the question of field hospitals. So when should you use the field hospital? I actually use them fairly sparingly. I would generally suggest that you don't use the field hospital early on unless you're really in trouble and your base is under assault. But trading one card for a warrior is a terrible deal. However, one rule amendment that was made to field hospitals actually allows you to trade one card for all the warriors who died in one battle. And this is really worthwhile. So if you suffer a major defeat, suddenly you can spend one card and get like 4 units back on your home base. This can be a real power play. So this is a huge boost to the Marquise, and it's one that you should take advantage of. On the subject of sawmills, don't build too many of these too quickly when you can't use the resources to build more buildings and spend them, because as wood accumulates, they become a very tempting target for your feisty foes, and exposing your wealth to the world and being a braggart about your prowess is a losing strategy. So I tend to do the sawmills in lockstep with the recruiting abilities and also with the crafting. So on the subject of crafting, you craft in the daylight by activating workshops. There's lots of great cards in this game for you. And as I mentioned earlier, the 2 rabbit clearings are the way to go. So there's some great cards for you if you get those 2 rabbit clearings. The Better Burrow is awesome. It lets you and another player draw another card at the start of Birdsong. If you get this up early in the game, then you're going to cycle cards quicker and you'll increase your odds of getting other cards, which will improve your build. The Command Warren, this is the most brilliant card for you. It lets you initiate a battle at the start of daylight. So when you get a pesky WA laying sympathy down, you can just knock that out and it doesn't cost you a turn. And remember, as the Marquise, you only get 3 actions. This is your huge limitation. It's your Achilles heel that you don't have that many actions, so you can overcome it with crafting. The other card to use for this is the Cobbler, which gives you an extra move at the start of the evening. Again, completely dominant if you can get this card down. Having that extra move just gives you the mobility around the board. If you build in the corner adjacent to the rabbit clearing, you can craft 2 workshops there very quickly, and you'll be in business. Your biggest weakness is the cats, limited actions. So the Eyrie, they can stack a ton of actions, and your limit is 3, so you've really got to make good use of them. So since you're going to be fighting a lot, other cards that can be good for you are Sappers. The Armorer cards are solid choices. It makes other players think twice about attacking you if they take big losses. I also like to keep ambush cards in hand so that when someone does attack me, it's going to take a lot to chisel through. Another solid option is a Tax Collector, which lets you convert a warrior into a card. This is situational, so in some games you'll have really great card draw and you won't need this card, but it's also a little harder to get going because it takes 3 workshops to activate of 3 different suits, so sometimes that can be a challenge. Finally, any card that gives you VPs is a really good card. So for instance, Investments gives you 3 victory points and it requires 2 bunnies, so that's a perfect card for you. So turning to wild bird cards. So for your faction, I would recommend that you almost exclusively use wild bird cards for gaining extra turns. The one major exception would be to save an ambush card to protect and defend your holdings, because if you're up against the Woodland Alliance, it can be a challenge, but you always want to activate your bird cards to get the extra turn before you take out their sympathy. I've made this mistake many a time. If you attack them and you've got a bird card in hand, you're gonna lose that card to them. So instead, burn the card first, get your extra turn, then when you battle them, they actually draw from the deck rather than from you. By the way, if you're getting value from this strategy guide, please consider giving us a like and a sub to help our channel grow. And if you have thoughts on strategy and you'd like to add anything to the conversation, please add that in the comments. So unfortunately, as the player in all parts of the forest, the responsibility for policing your opponents and every other faction in the game rests squarely on your shoulders, whether you like it or not. So you have to keep the table focused on who the biggest threat is. This is in a human game as opposed to the AI game where they never seem to listen to me, and make deals, right? So I'll knock this base out if you can take that one out. And the Vagabond can be so effective against your biggest enemy, the WA. So you can make common enemies, and this distracts attention from your position, which is often very vulnerable and precarious, especially early on. The Marquise doesn't burst on scoring like the other factions do. She tends to build slowly and surely, and players can see the victory coming from a long way away. So it's really important that you keep your eye on the factions that do burst, and you need to knock them back while you can. You're serving as the counterinsurgency here. And the key to the Cat's victory is to slow down the other players long enough for you to get to the finish line first. To do this, you need to know how to slow down each of the other major factions. So let's take a look at that. So we've got the Eyrie. If you need to stop the Eyrie, pay attention to their decree. This is the easiest way. Find a way to break that decree. When they lose that, the wild bird cards count against them. They're going to lose a lot of points and they're dead in the water. So that may mean withdrawing troops from a certain type of clearing so they have no one to battle. It might mean taking out a roost so that they can't build in that particular suit. Or perhaps you need to amass troops adjacent to them so it makes it really impossible for them to move and build, especially if all the build locations are filled up. Remember, they need to rule either the origin clearing, the destination clearing, or both to be effective. So the Eyrie are quite often the lead opposition to the Marquise. I would actually say second to the WA, but another viable option is to completely stay out of their sphere of influence and to not antagonize them. This is most true if you're playing with humans more so than with the AI. Okay, moving on to the Woodland Alliance. Your best tool against the Alliance is martial law, and this is what forces them to spend an extra matching supporter to spread sympathy to your clearing. And so this makes it actually very pricey for them to expand into your zone. So often you'll find that they'll go off in a different direction, and then they'll end up fighting your opponents a lot more than you. So if you can get those 3 units down, that's really what you're going for, 3 units per clearing. And that becomes enough of a challenge that people aren't going to be taking you out too often. Anytime you see sympathy undefended, where it threatens, say, a crop of your buildings and units, your decision is made. Destroy it. It's best if you don't have a card matching the clearing you're in, or you'll have to give it to the WA. But remember, you win a point for a victory that's guaranteed. Those little sympathy cute little mice can't fight back, so you get a point automatically. Be sure that you don't ever allow the WA to get all 3 of their bases up and running, because when they do, your game is over. However, your growth can sometimes stall out if you get into a sympathy battle with the WA. And what I mean by that is early on, if say you've got 1 unit in each of 2 different clearings and they lay down a sympathy in each, if you're removing 2 sympathy mice each turn, that only leaves you 1 move to either recruit, build, or move, and it's going to be really hard to use martial law if you can't get enough troops into those clearings in order to prevent more sympathy from coming. And if you play the AI, they're relentless. They just keep slamming down sympathy, so don't get into a sympathy battle. Fortify and defend 1 of those clearings and let the other one go. So you might retreat 1 unit into the other square, take out the 1 unit, and you're good. So try to force the Woodland Alliance to battle the other critters by channeling them away from your zone using martial law. All right, what to do about the Vagabond? So a crafty player trying to slow down the Vagabond will be sure not to craft what the Vagabond needs. This is a really passive way because they don't see what's in your hand, so you're not going to piss them off that you're not crafting that teapot that they really need. Teapots are the key for the Vagabond. If you can starve them of teapots, then they can't refresh enough items to be effective in the late game where they shine. And the cool thing is, this player can actually be helping you throughout the game, right? So I love when a Vagabond comes and clears away the ruins for me, and then I can build an extra building in that square. So it's good to be on good terms with this player. I'd also suggest trying to unite the board against a strong Vagabond, because everybody knows if a Vagabond gets out of control, they're just going to decimate everyone. So if you can work together to force them to rest, they lose a complete turn. Do that twice and their game is over before the game even begins. So all this being said, don't be afraid to cut a deal with a weak Vagabond. Agree to craft an item that they need if they help you take down the board leader. I don't have too much to offer for the Lizard Cult. The main way that the Lizard Cult can take advantage of you is to convert your units, so just be sure to destroy their gardens when they venture too close to your defensive perimeter. That's your major strategy against them. For the Riverfolk Company, they are a faction that won't really give you significant benefits. You don't really need to use their rafts because you have influence everywhere on the map from the outset. Other players will likely be using mercenaries against you because you have the most formidable army on the board, so this means that your best option is to just not give the Riverfolk too many of your warriors, because that currency can then be used against you. So again, you're going to starve them out. So let's talk about the late game en route. One effective approach that you can use in the late game is to bait players into destroying your buildings. They get a point for that. So as long as they're not in too strong of a position, this can work. But then you can rebuild the next turn and get 3 to 4 points, and they're likely softened from the battle that they just fought with you. So you can also string together higher point bursts. So consider moving to own a clearing and building in the same turn. Because remember, if your troops are left in a clearing between turns, your opponents can come in and take them out, and then you can't build there. So you'll have wasted the move action, since you'll need to repeat the move action in the next turn. So just in one single turn, string together your actions so you can move, attack, build, and you can get a series of points. Let's talk about overall strategies. Action management is critical for this faction. So how do you spend your limited options? And I would argue that this is like triage. So look at who the board leader is, and you need to diffuse that. So if the WA isn't a problem on the board, then you can let them run wild a bit. Look at who's threatening you directly. This would be the next level of triage. If the WA has sympathy in one of your big clearings, take it out. Then look at where you need troops to rule so that you can build the following turn. You can begin to set up those plays in advance and know, okay, I'll be moving here, I'll be doing this, and it's good to plan multiple turns ahead. You can either recruit soldiers there or you can move them there. So another strategic principle that I would consider very central is to adapt to how the board evolves. This is more important than anything else. The Marquise can group their clearings together in a clump, or they can string them out in a line around the periphery of the map. So you have to keep your supply lines intact, or you won't be able to build in a remote clearing. But you can find points everywhere on the board. Sometimes it might be just killing sympathy, it's a couple of points, destroy unprotected roosts, or even build a workshop that matches a card in hand for a few extra points on your next turn. All of these points add up. Just before we get to a few more strategic principles, I want to mention dominance. So unlike many of the other factions, the dominance victory is actually very appealing for the Marquise de Cat. It's not a strategy I personally enjoy using that much because I tend to like winning through sheer dominance and 30 points. But I think this is a very valid strategy. You start the game looking like an overpowered menace, and as the game goes on, your opponents grow stronger and you become an easy target. So the dominance victory is a targeted approach that lets you capitalize on your early point scoring, so you get up to the requirement for that card very quickly, and it lets you avoid the hard slog in the late game when you just can't seem to keep warriors on the board. So also remember that you have the largest army, and your field hospital lets you keep them on the board. So gaining dominance in particular areas or particular clearings on the board is actually something that's very attractive for the Marquise. Let's go to final thoughts. The reason Root is so good is because every game evolves in its own way. There's no hard and fast rule on what order to build your buildings in. In one game, it might serve you better to build Sawmills really quickly and to rush your buildings out and score your victory points that way. But that would require a board where you could dominate enough clearings to get your buildings down. If you have the right cards in hand, you might do more crafting to gain extra actions and points, and you might switch it up. Instead of building 2 bunnies, maybe there's a better option for you by getting your workshops and other clearings. So if you want to take a military approach, you can spam recruiting stations, get the card draw, and fight your way to victory. There are many paths to victory, which is why the Marquise is so challenging to win with. But this also makes them really interesting to play. When I began to consistently beat the AI on hard, it was using variable approaches guided by all these strategic principles that I've offered in the video, but it was tempered with a flexible and adaptable style of play. So you really need to read the board, see where the openings are, and find your points that way. If this video helped you, you might enjoy watching some of our other strategy guides. We've done all of the factions in the game. Links will follow. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate you sticking with us.